A long time ago, I said to never, ever, ever buy a AAA PC game at launch, and that advice still stands. The only real sad thing about getting the opportunity to review this video game in particular is that, like with all the big Bethesda RPGs, I would have rather waited to play it months later with a bunch of patches and mods installed. Because, like with all the big Bethesda RPGs, there's a pervasive layer of technical ineptitude here that you can see in almost every single mechanical action the player inputs, starting with the clunky 30 millisecond wind-up time between pressing a movement button and actually moving. The version of Fallout 4 that I've been playing for about a week before launch has had characters teleport in and out of elevators, get stuck in terrain, and clip through the ground. Sometimes the terrain LOD will disappear in certain spots, the firing button will become unresponsive, conversations will just need to be repeated because they didn't register the first time, and guns magically reload every time you change weapons, and those are just a few of many issues that seem like unintentional glitches. But the level of Fallout 4's quality of presentation, what is actually deliberately baked into the game, isn't great either. And it's something that's probably seen worse during your first few encounters with the new dialogue system.
You'll be stronger, tougher, resistant to rads, and get the suit. You can rip the minigun.
The new dialogue system is janky. Janky as hell. Characters will cut themselves off mid-sentence, they'll talk over each other. Some lines of dialogue will be mastered differently than others within the same character's speech of the same conversation. Factor in the absurdly low-resolution textures and incredible frame rate drops for urban areas, and you have a level of quality that would have skewered this game right out the door had it come out by any other developer. But this is Bethesda, and I'm truly wondering if they're going to be able to get away with it this time. The level for polish here is much, much lower than the high point in their lineup that was Skyrim. It is more unpolished than Fallout 3, but it is at least smoother than the launches of Oblivion and New Vegas. Although it was full of bugs and glitches and an incredibly awkward dialogue system, it at least crashed on me only once. So that's something. The first day, when I was having to get used to all this jank and also discovering a control scheme and mechanical core that are almost carbon copies of Fallout 3, was rough. But as the days went on, I gradually discovered, deep down underneath all the jank and zigzagging quality, a massively compelling and satisfying game. Not necessarily a compelling world or RPG, but a game nonetheless. I'm a huge fan of New Vegas, which was, after months of polishing and modding, one of my favorite experiences of the entire previous console generation. Stacked up to that, it's highly unlikely that Bethesda's efforts could have trumped Obsidian's, but they still gave it an honest try and ended up with something that does give it credence to the Fallout title. But as amazing as it is that Bethesda can push out an expensive mass-marketed AAA game with this bar of polish, it's almost more amazing that they've turned Fallout's cynical black humor into tongue-in-cheek sarcasm all about cartoon heroics.
Insert something Shakespearean involving death and your inevitable doom here.
The occurrence of lines like that vary wildly by the character. The story starts incredibly awkwardly and stays so for a few hours until meeting someone whose great voice acting and animation felt like they were from a different game entirely. The central hub city in this one has a lot of character and charm, but the rest of the wasteland lacks that wholeheartedly. That inconsistency is a trait shared by the main quest, which begins with some dreadful RPG orthodoxy, only to get really weird later, and kind of interesting in ways that feel like Bethesda might have learned a thing or two from New Vegas. Just like in that game, the main quest intersects and reacts with a lineup of faction quests that have you painfully juggling just how many different people you want to be friends with all at once. Sure, you can let the quest objectives lead you along for the ride, but the writing does react to the player acting out. A right shot towards the wrong person can sabotage those objectives. You can zigzag between different quests and quick loads and decision branches to find a surprising amount of reactivity and twists behind what starts as a dreadful paint-by-numbers quest to rescue your custom-made hideous mutant family.
Hon, you look as good as the day we met.
But the reason why this game had me happily tranced away for 50 hours this past week And why I think it's still a pretty good game despite all its issues is partially the inclusion of the gimmicky town-building minigame. They've noticed that modders for these games really like making their own houses, so the big back-of-the-box bullet point feature in this one is that you can hold a button down to turn on editor mode and start placing a whole lot of prefab objects anywhere. And half the time they'll end up floating in the air, but I don't really mind Bethesda's barely working technology in this case, because it's plugged into an awfully addicting metagame of economics and efficient design that had me glued to the screen for hours, dreading whenever I'd have to eventually quit. So you ally towns with your faction, then clean up all the junk lying around and recycle those materials back into new homes, new towns, new markets, and entire map-wide trading routes in a valiant attempt to make America great again. I got sucked deep down into that hole. It's entirely optional, but doesn't feel like it because all the looting and scavenging you do outside of those towns feeds back into them, and maybe the main quest will have something to do with it once or twice, I don't know. And you're incentivized to pay attention to the town building because they didn't put a lot of buried treasure in this game. You're not likely to find epic stashes of fat cash anywhere. This time you gotta make the cash out of your own economy yourself, and the best gear will also come from that same building and crafting system that'll eventually, and very slowly, lead you down crafting upgrade trees towards overpowering late-game tech. And with every piece of junk having something to do with your town's prosperity back home, it makes you have to wake up and pay attention to all the trash you're scrolling past, because everything out there is useful in some way. Unfortunately, they haven't attached any new mechanics to the fast travel system or the lockpicking and hacking minigames. You can still reset your failed tries by backing in and out of a computer screen because, for the most part, your basic interactions with this game are made out of a damn near carbon copy of Fallout 3. But doing a complete overhaul of crafting and then applying it to town building plus a new city's worth full of fresh content with a few truly improved features in there does feel like enough game changers to warrant a sequel. Admittedly, this is a new engine and a new pack of assets, and calling it Fallout Reconstruction or something would have meant a whole lot of lost sales, but the change in priorities had me doing something incredibly neat that you can't fully embrace in the previous Fallout games. And that is playing a kind of political, economical community leader, a businessman who buys and sells goods into a complicated junk economy that turns decayed industrial plots into thriving little farming villages. Someone who'd rather use the power armor for construction rather than combat. And that's a very different mindset to play Fallout in. It's not The Sims. Your villagers don't have to climb onto and sleep in these beds for you to fill the bed quota, they just gotta be there. So you learn how to Tetris beds into the tightest, most efficient layout possible, using the least amount of materials so you can sell the surplus back into investments towards shops that generate revenue that you can feed into your next town. It's actually janky as hell and barely working, but it's also dastardly sinister fun. And as a post-apocalyptic FPS RPG town builder, it certainly makes Fallout 4 stand out in this series, if not for the year. But this is also a year that gave us Witcher 3 and Metal Gear Solid 5. It's a year of big sandbox games that finally managed a substantial level of mechanical and visual quality to scale with their quantity. I've been spoiled, and going back to one of Bethesda's worlds, full of robotic animation, clunky movement, poor visibility, the inefficiency of that tab menu, an abundance of long loading screens, and a complete lack of ladders, is rough. As much as I want to like it, and as much as I can vouch for what beautiful messes Bethesda games are, at some point I just can't ignore what's happening on the screen right in front of me. Fallout 3 came out in 2008, 7 years ago, and for this game to play so similarly, especially after Skyrim made so many improvements on Oblivion, I can't help but see it as some sign of a kind of creative bankruptcy going on, especially since their standards for painting an image on the screen that makes sense and looks okay have seemed to have gone down since Skyrim. The suspension of disbelief that's required to enjoy these games comes from the stories they allow the player to make, powered by a role-playing engine capable of making huge worlds so minutely interactive that you can pick up a fork off a table. But after playing this kind of game for 5 times in the past 10 years, diminishing returns are gonna kick in eventually. The story I told, of trumping the Wasteland's economy to create boxes of Tetris beds, was great. That was a really fun time. There are a few great one-off side quests too, and the main quest has quite a few high points of its own, particularly with the interesting things it does with the optional faction quest lines that end up weaving in and out of it. But those faction quest lines themselves got absolutely shafted. When you're not doing some basic fetching, faction leaders and panicking settlers will regularly ask you to clear out some bad guys somewhere for someone, and that's pretty much as complicated as those quests get. If this stuff isn't procedurally generated, it might as well be, because they were by far the most frequent and the most dull quests I was encountering by a huge margin. But the relatively avoidable issue of bad quests existing somewhere unfortunately turns into a genuine hair-pulling frustration thanks to some bad genes that Fallout 4 inherited from Skyrim. You can't opt out of these, or any quest you even hear mention of. If someone's about to ask you to do something you don't got time to do, then turn around and run the hell away.
What next? I've gotten word about a settlement that's being threatened by raiders.
Or else it'll get stamped on your to-do list forever, without your permission, without any way to hide it either. It'll take up space on that list and time from your day that could be spent doing the good stuff. And speaking of the good stuff, that main quest is still hamstrung by streamlining RPG conventions in a way that doesn't really work for Fallout. They stripped away skills and weapon prereqs, and believe it or not, that isn't really a low point for me, since you now level into skills as perks, gradually working your way into a specialized role as the game difficulty gets higher. The perks have multiple levels with a whole lot of effects that aren't obvious, and my only real gripes with the system are how hard the screen is to navigate. But I do have a hard gripe with how the quests are made to accommodate this system. There's an explosive intro quest that has you blasting away Deathclaws with a minigun 1 hour into the game, and there's certainly a lot of slow-burning character-building satisfaction lost because of that. But the area where they really dropped the ball here is the bad new dialogue system. Biggest reason being that you'll never have more or less than 4 dialogue choices, with no more than 2 words explaining each, and that is simply positively not enough. And between all 4 of them, your character doesn't seem to ever want to tell people no. Especially in the main quest, it's just rarely an option. Between this and the inability to opt out of quests, it would seem that the devs really want you to do every quest in the game with your first character, even though the specialization you gradually level into does give you reason to start it all over again with different stats. You can't say no when villainous factions ask you to do villainous things, but instead, you sure as hell always have the sarcastic option. And that's just... What does sarcastic even mean here? Is it a sarcastic agreement or a sarcastic disagreement or an insult? It just says sarcastic. It's an adjective. It's one word. And I'd rather it say no. Some things are worse, but some things are better. The combat has been improved considerably. Guns now punch and kick with smooth, snappy animations, and the enemy AI does a remarkable job of throwing grenades, sticking to cover, and shooting through small openings, especially considering the system they're working within. This is the first time I've been impressed by enemy AI in years. When it is working, of course. And then there's just the classic Elder Scrolls core loop of player-driven exploration and discovery that makes any session of this game hard to put down. Just make sure you run the hell away from all the quests you don't want to do, and you'll find that there's always something new to explore, and it's always satisfying finding out what it is. Because just like every other game in the Fallout and Elder Scrolls repertoire, the Commonwealth Wasteland is built with a 90s simulationist design that feels like they built and laid out the world far before they ever thought about how the player would play through it. And unlike Fallout 3, the Wasteland in this one does have some thought put into its farms, its water lines, and its infrastructure. Settlements, services, and people are all placed with a density of detail that makes everything feel like it makes sense in the grand scheme of things. But the deciding factor to this game's legacy, and the most important question for this review, is how many interesting stories can that world tell? And unfortunately, the answer is somewhere on the lower end of the spectrum. Truly exciting, open-ended, reactive quests are too few and far between, and far too many of them are simple fetching or base-clearing affairs, and far too many times I felt like I was fast-traveling back and forth to get a menial job done, rather than embarking on a grandiose adventure. Fallout 3's melancholy magic was short-lived but hit hard, and New Vegas's surreal, anarchistic politics and humor had me glued for over 200 hours. Fallout 4 is certainly one of the better games of a damn good year of games. It's fine for now, but considering the legendary legacy of this franchise, there's no way it's a new gold standard for it. A lot of that has to do with the underwhelming reality of delayed innovation in the games business. It iterates on a standard Bethesda set 7 years ago, rather than making Fallout play in some kind of spectacular new fashion, which is what Bethesda was trying for 7 years ago. And maybe another factor is the sheer lack of polish that it made its first impressions with. Fallout 4 might have the potential to be one of the greats, but as good as it is, it doesn't deserve to be played in this state. This is not how you should let the game introduce itself to you when you have the easy option of just waiting a couple months for patches and mods to polish it up. At that point, Fallout 4 is likely to be a fantastic way to spend a whole month of time with, if not more. But until then, here's a short clip of what I had to put up with for now. Someone I needed to talk to progress a quest decided to spawn on a roof for some reason. So this is what we're dealing with. Hopefully it'll convince you to wait this one out, at least a little bit.
Sturgis, remember that holotape with all the Institute data? I need it back.
Oh yeah?
Sturgis, remember that holotape with all the Institute data? I need it back.
Oh yeah?
Sturgis, remember that holotape with all the Institute data? I need it back.
Oh yeah? Hope this rain lets up soon.
This place is really coming together, huh? I can't take all the credit.
Sturgis, remember that holotape with all the Institute data? I need it back.
Oh yeah?
Why? What have you got cooking?